record. So our topic for today is a follow-on from what Dr. Miller talked about in our last webinar, this question about culture and some of the aspects of culture that deal with change. So I'm going to go ahead and put some slides up here real quickly that you all can take a look at. And again, I will email these out when we're done. So can everybody see that? Is there anybody that can't see it? Good. Okay. So if you remember back from the beginning of our program, we talked about this model. So we're dealing with issues over in the visionary organizational leadership side, especially this question of how we think within our organizations about creativity, innovation, change, and operational effectiveness. And I think Dr. Miller brought out a really good point in his discussions. So it's this section here last week about culture, and this is what he used as a definition of culture. I'll let you read that, but it's this question of meaning inside an organization in this question of lived values. Lots of times I get a question, I do this presentation for the University of Texas each year, the LBJ School, on Concordia University, Texas relocation. I mean, we literally, like Concordia, Wisconsin did about 25 or 30 years ago, we sold our campus, bought a new one, and moved the whole university. And one of the questions I kind of get is, well, Dr. Seidel, did you come to Concordia with the intent of moving the campus? And the answer to that is no. In fact, it was a further say survival was the question when I got there. But had I tried to do that when I first got there, first of all, there was no level of trust built up between me and the institution. But also, I had no idea what the culture of the institution was like, what was important to it. How did they live out their faith and values? These questions about meaning. And it took time and a lot of listening to begin to understand that. So as we talk about change, as we talk about innovation, Bernard Boulles it all happens within this context of culture. Mike, do you want to throw anything in there? Just, I borrowed your slide. I hope that was okay.
That's way okay, and I agree completely with what you said as a setup. So nothing to add.
Okay. As we think about that, I also was at Valpo, taught a grad level course in leadership in this Globe studies, House and others. And when you get these slides, I have a whole series of notes underneath them. So there'll be website references and things like that. So please take a look at those too. But the Globe studies was a set of research begun by this fellow by the name of House back in the early 1990s. And Globe stands for Global Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness. And what was interesting, this question of culture was so important that they decided to look across multiple cultures to see how leadership was viewed. And so what they looked at were 9 dimensions of culture that, oh, by the way, frame lived values. So the good news or bad news about this is it is a Western philosophical overlay on the question of culture and the question of leadership. So some of these questions have those biases built into them. But what's interesting about what they looked at within these 9 dimensions were how they varied over various cultures, as in international and national level cultures. But you can look at these same 9 dimensions when we look at the cultures of our own institutions. So that's why I kind of put this in there. The work they've done so far covers 62 countries and more than 17,000 individual analyses of these 9 dimensions across culture. So an interesting thing to look at, something to think about, again, in terms of these dimensions inside your own institution, or even inside your own particular office or group. So given all that, as we think about culture, complexity is an important part of this whole thing. And we live in a complex world, which we're actually seeing it acting out here in the United States today as we vote. And I'm a little bit of a math nut, so bear with me when I talk about this. But Dan Allender, in a book called Leading with a Limp, talks about these particular costs of leadership. And one of these is they are complex. We work within complex systems. So being a math nut, if you've ever heard much about weather or fractals, and you may have heard this little story about how a butterfly fluttering someplace in South America can affect the weather here. These complex systems have states, and in this particular case, I did a little model, and this system comes to an equilibrium very quickly and stays that way. Again, not hard calculations. However, if you change one parameter, just one single thing in this system by 0.1%, it goes bananas. And it becomes unpredictable. And I would argue whether we're looking at a social service agency or a university, we are living within a complex system, and not to be afraid of change. That's not the part about this I want to emphasize, but to understand that small changes can have huge effects, and you need to be ready for that. So here's a question for the group in terms of this question of complex systems. Why are we complex systems? Anybody?
Because individuals are complex and you get a whole bunch of individuals together. It multiplies.
Because we're human beings,
yeah.
Right?
Well, and I know the complexity I feel regularly is that we have a lot of partners outside of, it's not a single agenda anymore. There's a lot of agendas of, this organization is hoping that we'll partner on this, or this organization hoping it feels like there's a lot of agendas that make it very complex now.
Well, and Megan, that's a really interesting observation, because those agendas are not only internal to external. Those agendas also compete inside your institution, right? Within different offices and different groups of people. Great. Any others?
I know I've said this before too, and Megan, like you, we also have a lot of those external partners. But we have kind of still that divide between a lot of faculty members that have been here for a long time, and higher education is changing a lot. It's changed very rapidly over the last 10 to 20 years. So we still, I think, have that complexity because we kind of have like those traditional on-campus students, and then we also have kind of the online version. So we have the complexity there as well.
Anybody else want to throw this in? Pat, from your perspective on Lutheran social service agencies, how about them in terms of complexity?
Kind of unmute. Yeah, I mean, the more customer or client focused you become, the more complex you get. And we have 23 distinct lines of service, all serving really unique customers. And I think that's what drives a lot of our complexity.
Yeah, great point. And that gets sort of back to what Sarah said about this question of, it was one thing to be an academic institution that did traditional undergraduate, but lots of our institutions, and I would almost argue a majority of them now, do the same sort of thing, Pat, in terms of lines of service. There's non-traditional, there's online, there's graduate, there's traditional, and trying to manage all those at the same time can make for a pretty complex organization. And I'll give you an example. Phil, I don't know if you remember this from Concordia, Texas, but we were trundling along with actually an incredible revenue stream in terms of non-traditional online and non-traditional classroom space at other facilities until the state of Texas changed the funding formula for teachers getting Masters of Eds and other degrees at academic institutions. When they changed that, we lost almost overnight 350 students.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, Phil. I mean, it was amazing. And what happened to us was how fast that happened. We didn't even have much time to anticipate it. We always kind of in planning thought about wild cards. What are the things that can move us from case 1 to case 2, right? Between those two. But that one wasn't on the table, and boy, it hit. And talk about getting your attention real quickly. It did. And that goes with social service agencies too here. So here's just a few things to think about with complex systems, some characteristics of them, and you all have hit most of these. Large numbers of interacting components, pieces that fit together, things that self-organize hierarchically. There is this range of stable, but it seems like you can poke it all you want and it's all fine, but then you hit something, and a very small change ends up in large results. That's called emergent behavior. So we live within this culture. It is necessarily complex because, as Yvonne pointed out from the get-go, we're a bunch of human beings trying to do things here. And one of the key points of this whole thing, an aspect of what we do, is power. So here's my next question for the group, and I have some references for you that you can look up. So tell me about that. What's power? Where do you see power inside your institution?
Resource control.
Otherwise, Tim, known as money, right?
Money.
How about
I see power with those who have influence, both in terms of influence over the student body, influence within the student body. If I'm thinking of a student who, if you're planning an event, there's a handful of students that you absolutely want on your side because they're going to make it go, right? Those students have influence and power among others.
Nice. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about influence here in a minute too, because that is exactly right, Ryan. That is an aspect of power. It's influence. Money.
Decision making.
Yep. Which could be revenue neutral, right, Yvonne? But it could go right or left, just depending.
I just finished hiring adjunct teachers for next semester, and one person got a class and the next person didn't, right? So it's like, I'm very uncomfortable being in that position, I'll say, but.
Yeah, but it's the truth. And,
somebody has to make those decisions, yeah.
I live in a neighborhood that has 3 aspects. So we live in this little separate city. One is called Old Sunset Valley. Then another is called Old New Sunset Valley, which is where we live. And then there's New Sunset Valley. And it's only 650 people, and we're pretty evenly split. But power shifts among those 3 hubs every election, right? And so we're going through it today. We've got 2 city council members and a mayor. And then the question will be, where do they come from? Old Sunset Valley, new, or old new? So it just shifts. It seems ridiculous, but we see that in faculty senates. We see that in boards on how power can shift based on who's there. So we got decision-making, we've got money. How about anything else? Anybody else want to throw in?
I say reputation is.
Oh.
I think whoever can make or break, well, and it crumbles faster than it can. So if you have the power to his reputation or to build up a reputation amongst a group, that's a tremendous amount of power.
And Megan, look at the power of social media. That's and Portland's lived through that over the last year. Holy cow. And it's an incredible amount of influence that can be enacted or implemented in milliseconds.
Used for good or bad.
Truth or not truth, fake news or not. Here's go ahead.
As I said, the power of money can go both ways too. I think the ability to generate revenue can be a source of power within an organization for the folks in charge of enrollment and the folks in charge of fundraising.
Yeah. Good point. So here's a question, and I don't know whether this is endemic to nonprofits or it's higher education or whatever, but why do we have a hard time talking about it? I mean, if you want to see people cringe in an academic environment, just mention power.
Well, I think that we're all feeling that egalitarian is the way to go, and that the benefits that the custodians and dishwashers have are the same benefits as our presidents enjoy. And so it gets uncomfortable when we talk about those who have a differential.
Okay, good point. It's hard to talk about power differential. And we see that in all kinds of ways, right, Steve? I mean, we see it in terms of hierarchical power, but we see it between, races and culture and ethnic backgrounds, all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, very politically driven.
I think it scares people sometimes to talk about it.
Yeah, Tom, I would say nobody wants to be known as a power grabber, right? I mean, nobody wants that reputation of being the one who's looking or seeking power, so we'd rather not even talk about it.
Yeah, good point.
But Brian, is it a positive thing to be known as a power player?
Ooh. I don't know if anyone wants that reputation either.
I would think, this is Mike, I would think that some people do. And we talked last time about the match of structure and the way things are supposed to work and the way the hierarchy is supposed to work and how decisions are supposed to be made. And then there's this political frame, and there are players within that try to grab power or assume they have the authority to grab power, and that kind of confuses the system. I think the historical placement of in shared governance of having faculty have major voices about how the institution is run gets messy, and just like occasionally trustees want to reach in and get in the weeds, I think faculty may reach in and say the food service ought to be doing this, or health services ought to be doing that, or student affairs isn't really conceiving of this correctly. So I think there's a fairly common dialogue about where the power is. Is it with the structure, or is it with whomever believes they have authority to affect decisions? I think that's pretty standard in higher ed, and we can probably all name names about who wants to aspire outside of their structural position to have major influence on decisions about the direction of the institution, or who's even of worth within the structure.
Yeah, Mike, I think those are really important points. And sometimes in higher education and nonprofits, we try not to talk about this, but I would argue we have to talk about it, and where it lies and who has what. And I'm sure, again, our folks in nonprofits as well as higher education, I mean, we see it every day when donors attempt to exert power. Mm-hmm. I mean, they'll give money with conditions, whether it's endowment money for scholarships where they say, hey, we want this to go for this, or it's a naming of a building or a new program or support. I mean, they are sometimes very egalitarian about how they do it, but other times it's about exerting power.
Mm-hmm.
So my basic argument is we have to talk about it, and how power is allocated within institutions between faculty and support staff and administration, and even within the faculty, how it's allocated between department and schools is critically important. How power impacts social service agencies. One of the things we've seen here in Texas with LSS, which is no longer called LSS here, is the power of the federal government and state to regulate what you can do or not do with their money.
Sure.
And we see that all the time. So here's a great quote. And this came, I love this, because there's always this question about power corrupting. And Robert Caro, it doesn't always corrupt. What it does is it always reveals. It always reveals motivation. It always reveals centers. So again, what it's worth, I love this in terms of when we talk about power. This is a framework definition for that, and I have the references for this in the notes pages. This actually comes out of a book by Nordhaus, and you all hit on this. It's about the ability to influence decisions and control resources, and that Nordhaus defines it as one of the three forces of leadership. So just a quick review of power. There's, and this is a classic academic view, the 7 different types. Within positions, you have these sets of powers. And I think you've all probably pretty much seen that. At an individual level, these personal power buckets are really important. I think, Ryan, I think it was you who mentioned the question about what students you get on board for a project. I mean, that's all about personal power, right? Especially in the referent power bucket. I mean, these are people that can influence other people. Cotter, when Cotter and Heath talk about change, they really talk about finding at a personal level those people within an institution that can help you in terms of change. And it can be either expert, referent, or prestige, or some combination of those, but they're the ones that have influence. Another good thing to talk about in terms of power, and I actually gave this book to a friend who thought I was crazy, but this book, written by Robert Greene, 48 Laws of Power, huge, thick book. This book must be 1.5 inches thick. But he talks about power from a historic perspective, beginning back in the Middle Ages into today. And parts of it are pretty a Machiavellian approach to power. And sometimes I've used this to understand what type of power people are using in relationship with me, because there is lots of ways that people attempt to influence you. And it's useful to know that as you're going through a process. So 48 Laws of Power by Greene, sort of a standard book now on power. I just threw a couple of these on the table for you to think about. I really like 29. You got to plan all the way to the end. Pilots do that really well. We don't like running out of gas 10 miles short. So I am going to now break you all into groups, drop this, and here's the 2 questions I want you to talk within your groups. And then I'm going to give you about 6 or 7 minutes and bring you back. But in this, and it's going to be a random grouping, so I have no idea how this is going to turn out. I'm going to let Zoom do this. And it'll be into 4 groups, so there'll probably be 3 or 4 even a group. But where, when, and what type of power have you used, and where, when, and how have you seen power used inside your organization? So I'm going to stop the share right now, come back, go to 4 breakout rooms, and I'm showing it's now Central Standard Time, 12:26. We'll come back at 12:35. So the 2 questions: where, when, and what type of power have you used, and where, when, and how has power been used within your organization. So I'm creating rooms now. So off you go. Hi, Yvonne.
Hello.
Everybody's
Sorry.
coming back.
There we go. This is quite an interesting system. I've never seen anything like this.
Isn't it kind of fascinating? And
Yeah.
I actually could have rotated around all the groups, but I
Okay.
didn't. Since Diana and Lauren were on, I could have snuck around all the groups, but man,
Okay.
I thought that'd be a little creepy. So
Yeah, but boy, if you'd have come into our group, Tom, there'd have been trouble because you'd have been violating our sense of power.
way to go, Lauren. Let's bring it to a practical. So I just real quickly, so what type of power do you use? You use power, I know.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, as chair of faculty senate, there are times when the faculty don't want to make a decision, so I help them along in making a decision, or at least helping them decide on a process to make a decision, so that then we can collectively get there.
Yeah, and Kevin, the last piece that I want to block some time is to talk about decision making. I'm going to throw a model on the table.
Great.
That's one to think about. How about anybody else? Or the second question, where, when, and how have you seen power used within your organization?
One thing that our group talked about was how, depending on the group that you're working with, it can look different. Because Kevin was sharing coming from the faculty perspective, and I've kind of had the experience on both sides of the equation with being staff and being administrative, and then also being faculty, and just kind of the different ways that different groups process and make those decisions. So the way that you approach those different groups, you have to be cognizant of that, because there is a little bit of a difference in how they approach decision making, or don't.
Or don't. Good one. Anybody else want to throw in one final comment on this?
I shared an example of seeing power being used of a faculty member who has some formal power. It's director of a program, but mostly has informal power, which got him a very desirable office in our new building that opened last year. But then he's taken lately, he rides a Vespa scooter to work, and he's taken lately to parking it right next to the front door of the building when there's a bike rack, 10 feet away. And I think those kind of flexes, that kind of display of inappropriate power, can undermine your power in the long term.
Yeah, it's like, the president having his own personal parking spot about 10 yards from the administration building. And yeah, good points. So when we think about this question of power, and again, it exists inside this question of organizational politics. So why do you think that happens? Why within organizations that whether they're an agency that's really there, the moral purpose of our organizations is so high. I mean, we're there to serve people in their deepest needs, whether it's a social service agency, whether it's an educational agency or institution like our colleges and universities. Why does this happen? You've seen it happen inside your institutions. What do you think leads to that?
Well, I think isn't it a fight for resources and our own agendas that we feel are clearly much better than everybody else's?
Sure, Steve. And complex organizations, right?
Yeah.
It's all these human beings.
And I'd like to Yvonne's answer of just it's people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good one. How about any others? Well, here's my four, for whatever it's worth, along with what all you all talked about. First of all, unknowns. And that gets down to this question about communication. When people don't know an answer, they're going to make up an answer.
Mm-hmm.
So this question of unknowns and poor communication go together. Another one that I think forms this at whatever level that we get these politics is poor leadership and lack of trust, whether that's in a department, an office, a group, or over the entire institution. This happens when there's a lack of trust, and that's because people are afraid. fear underlies tons of this. And it would be really good to run a bazillion-dollar, an institution with an endowment. You never have to worry about resources, but fear is always part of it. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. It's in the slides for today, and the references are there. But this is out of the Harvard Business Review, and it's a really good kind of picture of ways to think about it. It's a very simple matrix of sources of power and where the activity takes place. From places where personal influence and informal networks rule, which we've all seen those, to places where there are very formal authority structures and hierarchy and bureaucracy. I don't know if y'all remember SADSEC. It was a cartoon about the military that was really a big deal in World War II and afterwards. And there was always this whole thing about formal authority and bureaucracy, about how many pieces of paperwork you had to fill out to get X. And so that's an example of that type. And so this also all revolves around culture. Culture's an incredibly important part of this. So these are two definitions of leadership that talk about this continuing of from culture to power to politics to this question now of leadership, the mega question. And I love John Maxwell, that it's all about influence, that leadership's all about that. And Cashman adds one adjective to that, and he calls it authentic influence that increases, creates value. So we live in a world that deals in influence. We see it all the time in social media. We see it all the time in our families. What's so much fun is now that we have grandkids is to watch our kids deal with their kids in influence. And so once you see a little kid cry, a little kid's cry could make parents jump through hoops you can't imagine. Well, you can't imagine if you're a parent. But these influence tactics are really interesting. And like Green's book on power, I think it's not only knowing the ones that you use, but also the ones that people around you use so you can identify those. So the next two slides has a list of kind of generic influence tactics. And again, this is out of, I've got 3 references in the notes for where these came from. But you can see this runs the range of rational persuasion all the way down to ingratiation and personal appeals. And then the next page is another set of 4. What's really fascinating, my father-in-law was an incredible guy. And he was also a pretty straightforward guy, but he lived by exchange. He did. Everything in his life was an exchange. And so when he did something, he expected somebody to do something back. Or if you did something for him, he would reciprocate doing something for you. This kind of trade space was always interesting. But that again was his kind of way of dealing with culture and nature and power, and it was an exchange ratio. So again, the point of this is to understand the ones that you use and also the ones that folks may be using in your context. So I'm not going to break up into groups for this, but what out of that list, and I'll put it back up, what influence tactics do you see used most often? Oops, sorry, wrong direction. There's the first page, 5 of them, and these ones.
I think I see at our institution a lot of, I think it was collaboration, but it was a term like that. So trying to get others on board, consultation.
Yeah.
I see a lot of that, but I also see by 2 people in power at this institution in particular. Next slide, it was pressure.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting watching different people try to navigate the landscape using those 2 different tactics of influence.
Mm-hmm.
How about anybody else?
I would say varied. It kind of depends on the situation, both for others and myself. You know, there are times when, well, typically not pressure. That one not my forte. But coalition tactics of kind of persuading, or at least developing kind of a group norm and influence that way. But sometimes, you know, using a kind of certain amount of authority to just help make a decision or get us started on a path. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
just it depends. It ebbs and flows.
I'll flip back to this one. Any others? We all think we do rational persuasion, I think. I mean, really, it's clearly this is the answer. So let's get done with it and move on.
Within that one, rational persuasion, what I see used a lot is asking questions.
Ah.
And often, you know what the right answer is when you ask it, or the person asking does. I think that's a form of power and persuasion. It's always nice to get the other person to think things through for themselves and come up with either the same answer or a different one.
Yeah. There's in this leadership course, I went back 2,000 or 3,000 years in terms of the history of leadership, Pat. And there's an ancient Chinese philosopher, Sun Tzu, who's, I used his quote, he said, a leader knows when you've made a good decision, when you can actually, everyone else thinks it was their decision, not yours.
Yeah. And the Japanese, we study Japanese Kaizen a little bit. They ask a question 5 times.
Yeah.
Okay, why is that happening? And then they'll say something, and okay, well, why is that? Why is that? And you usually can get down to a better root understanding of the issue. At least we'd like to think. I've also seen it said, Alfred Sloan, who ran GM for many years, once broke up a meeting by saying, we don't have enough disagreement here. We have a vibrant conversation. Let's get more facts. So.
Yeah. And, you know, these influence tactics, when used incorrectly, can have exactly the opposite effect that you want. I mean, if somebody tries ingratiation with me or legitimating tactics, that's absolutely the wrong thing to do with me. I mean, I'm going to go 180 out if somebody tries to pull that kind of stuff. So again, just know what you use, and either intentionally or unintentionally, in those types of tactics that can be used against you. So where does this all get us? And you all have touched on this. It's really this question of decision making. And I love this quote. Sally Jenkins wrote this, 7, 8 years ago in the Washington Post. But the 4 things followers want: integrity, confidence, decision-making, and clarity. And what they don't want, you can see that list, but it's indecisiveness. So the question becomes, how do you engage people in a decision-making process that helps them move down the road? So here's 2 references. And again, I'll be sending these out to you. I'm going to move through this last part kind of quickly, but especially the HBR on making smart decisions. And I think I sent out a bibliography earlier. These are things to watch out for when you're making decisions, and that comes right out of on making smart decisions. And I also, the framing Ariely, at the end of this set of slides, I include a video by him that you need to take a look at. We will not look at it today. So, a decision is a means to an end. We usually begin with a problem and choose a solution. There's a whole set of different ways to think about it. I'm only going to do one today. And so there's a reference for you there from Organizational Behavior by Kreitnick and Knickey, kind of a standard textbook in this. And you all are going to think I'm completely crazy when I do this, but it is really, really important for you to think about this. So I'm going to walk you through what's called the Vroom-Yetton-Yago decision model. So what this model does is gives you 6 questions to ask as you move forward on a decision. And what these questions do is help you understand the context of your decision in addition to the group that's around you. So here's the 6 questions that you ask in this process. I'll just let you look at them. As you can imagine, the technical quality, commitment, do you have the information? Do you understand the problem? Is the team going to be committed to it if you make it? What type of conflict levels? And does the team itself have enough information to make the quality decision? So we've got these 8 questions that then produce 5 different ways of looking at decisions. All the way from you make the decision with the information you got to group 2, which is basically a consensus, a consultative approach to making a decision. So here's what's going to drive you nuts when I put this chart up. So you will get this all in the slides, but here's what the model looks like. So I'm a geek, okay, I get this, and I don't expect you to have a copy of the Vroom, Yet, and Iago decision model in your middle desk drawer that you pull out every time you need to make a decision. But what's interesting about this are the 8 questions. And Kevin, you know, think about this in the context of your work with the Faculty Senate. Mm-hmm. Where do they fall? And I agree faculty want to be consulted on everything. I get that. But, and I have some sample problems and decisions here, but let's and remember we're complex organizations and there's people involved in this. But as we begin down the road, so here's an example decision. So your organization's about to enter a new facility. It's a state-of-the-art building. Stephen, you might remember this from the building you just moved into. That has the potential to change the entire group's outlook. As a department head, you've been given the responsibility for deciding the color of paint that will be used in the office spaces, okay? How are you going to decide on the paint? Let's go down to questions. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll let you all, we'll annotate this. Hopefully I can do this. Whoops. Let me get back up here again. Okay. So go down to the first question. How important is the technical quality decision for the color of paint? Anybody?
Minimally.
Minimal. I'm with you. I think it's low. And my my little doohickey here isn't working. I can't. I'm not doing a good job on. Oh, there it is. I got it now. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Draw. Okay. So we're down here, and we're going to go down here. So we're saying it's low. How important is team commitment to the decision?
It depends on the team.
Good one. It's human beings again, right?
I mean, honestly, from our experience when we moved into a new location, it was really important. And so we narrowed down colors, and then it became a team decision.
So, okay, and I'll give you an example. We were partners in a mission church where there was a big fight over the color of the chairs for the sanctuary. 5 years later, I was asked to do that, and I went, oh my gosh, no, we're not going to have this big fight. 5 years later, nobody cared anymore. It was a contextual, it was about power and influence, right? But at least let's go down your road. So let's go down here, so that's high. Okay, now we go to the CP question. If you make the decision yourself, will your team be committed to it?
You can always repaint.
Maybe at your institution.
But you can see where this ends up. If they're going to be committed, you go ahead and make the decision, right? You go up here. If you think, Lisa, in your point of view, where you knew there may be a whole bunch of underlying factors, like with the colors of those chairs, back with this church we worked with, it wasn't anything about the color of the chairs. It was a question about influence, power, and control, and people wanted to have a vote, which ended up down here. The best process would have been group 2, just because we needed to keep those people on board. So I picked a simple example here of what that might be, but you can see as you follow your way through this, it's not the end of the world in terms of decision making, but it asks you to ask the important questions as you go down the road to make a decision. And so that's kind of where I think the model can be very useful. Plus, I mean, if you want influence and you want to impress somebody, you can just say, we're going to use the Vroom, Yet, and Yago decision model. Everybody's going, really? So, and when you think about this, notice my little drawing stuff doesn't go off. Sorry about that. But when you think about these questions of making good decisions, these are things to review. Look at the model as a way to start. Review the traps that are listed before. Understand you're not going to get 100% consensus. You might, but you're probably not. And then whatever process you use, make it transparent. That's part of getting back to organizational politics. Okay, we've gone down a long road. So I'm going to stop the share here. In terms of power, this culture, this whole continuum from culture to power to influence tactics, and finally this question of decisions and how we make decisions. So anybody want to pitch in a question for the good of the order here at the end? And I will send out the slides today. You'll get them today. Perfectly clear.
Tom, I wanted to underscore the importance of transparency in that.
Yeah.
And the frequency of then trying to lead by inviting input and then moving on beyond it. So this is our situation. Here's the data. Here's how we're going to make a decision. Or how do you want to be involved in the decision, and trying to do that publicly so that if there are clear, if it's not somebody's role or it doesn't affect them or whatever, those kinds of things that can be called out internally in that conversation. 2 things that I've seen make a difference. How much time do we have?
Yeah.
A decision has to be made in the next 2 hours, or we've got 2 months. That's a different piece. And how much does it affect the work of the individual doing their jobs, so that you ought to be able to make a decision about who the plumber is. But if we're going to change a curricular decision or close 3 academic programs, it's a bigger, wider, more open thing. And as a result, that transparency gets inside the complexity of the situation that you presented very well.
Yeah, great point, Mike. And that whole paint thing, that actually came up when we moved to campus. So you can imagine buying an entirely new campus and trying to figure out what color paint you're going to paint everything. And actually that was an A1. We made the decision, all the paint over the entire campus was exactly the same. And basically drop kicked that decision down the road until somebody wants to repaint the place again. But Mike, it got down to it was a question of timing, because the longer we waited to make a decision, and we actually had an interior decorator figure it out. None of the senior staff knew how to do it. And it was expensive. I mean, it really got to be a cost factor too. We just had to make the decision quickly and didn't have a lot of time or capability to paint everything different colors.
That's an important distinction, I think, though, that you had an interior decorator, someone with expertise in that area, decide. It wasn't just your personal aesthetic preference that you were imposing, right?
Yeah. Plus, Stephen, I have no aesthetic preferences. I wouldn't. I mean, seriously, it could have been olive drab or blue. Whatever. So, good point. Tim, you look like you're thinking about something deeply.
Oh, I was looking out at the window, but no. I just, as I was thinking about Mike's comments, is that transparency and trust go hand in hand, and that's such an integral component of culture. You know, that if you want to have a healthy culture, transparency and then trust comes from that, I think. That's all. That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, no, it's really important. At least that gets down to some of your questions too, as those things are going on. And Stephen, as you're moving into new buildings, is there some foundational level of trust somewhere that you can begin to work from? Again, whether it's in an academic institution or a social services agency, it always comes down to this question of trust. And so, any last comments for the good of the order? If not, please keep Mary Ann's family in your prayers as they go through this mourning period. And it's, you know, it's always an emotional time when we lose mothers and fathers. It's a tough generational change. And I will send these out. Please have a wonderful, we won't be back together again until January. So expect updates towards in the break between Christmas and New Year's with scheduling and all that kind of good stuff for our next one. And if you have any questions or you want to throw something in when I send the slides out, feel free to do that.
Thanks for your work, Tom.
Oh, you bet. You all take care. We'll see you.
Thanks, Tom. Looking forward to seeing everybody in person soon.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, we will, the beginning of January.
That's right.
Kevin. See you then.
Yep. Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.